This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. I've seen a lot of theories over the past week regarding our dehydrated friend from the Breath of the Wild sequel trailer. My own theory can be found using the link in the description. While I myself have placed this figure as Ganondorf due to heraldry, adornments, and Gerudo text, the theories by no means end there. I've heard arguments for him being an ancient hero depicted in the tapestry in Breath of the Wild. Others argue a link to Zant via the reversed audio cues present in the trailer. Still others carry it further, all the way back to Demise. With all of these comes some confusion as to what Calamity Ganon was and how Ganondorf and Calamity Ganon could have evidently been in the same place at the same time. And does Demise even still exist? Or was he entirely absorbed by Ganondorf after his defeat in Skyward Sword? As I said, I've already given my theory on who this is, but to better understand all of these theories, I thought it might be helpful to dig into what I will refer to as Hyrule's Dark Trinity. I'm John Reardon, you're watching NWR TV. Join me as we delve into the entirety of Zelda lore and even some real-world theology in order to understand Demise, Ganondorf, and Ganon. Now, before I begin, it's important for me to note the method through which I decipher Zelda lore. My theories and explanations are, unless otherwise noted, built entirely on documented canon. This obviously includes dialogue, text, and events from within the games themselves, but the Hyrule Historia is of course a major source for this as well. The official Legend of Zelda encyclopedia, along with the Legend of Zelda arts and artifacts, can also serve as canon sources. I do not consider offhand interview comments to be canon, as they have not been officially presented. At best, they are educated headcanon, and while they're interesting topics of discussion, they are not fit to base entire arguments off of. Additionally, while I consider the Legend of Zelda manga series to be a great source of supplementary information, I will not regard it as strong canon, with the exception of the manga that was presented within the Hyrule Historia itself. I hold that its inclusion within an otherwise canon volume speaks to its validity as canon. Lastly, I will reference a few theological concepts within this video. It is not my intent to infer meaning where the original developer meant none, but rather to leverage the substantial research that has already been done on these concepts in order to flesh out some vague points in the lore. Now then, on with the video. When first the world was introduced to Hyrule's pervasive evil, it was in the form of Ganon, a pig-like monster with a devilish trident. He is at times incorporeal, coming and going as he pleases. In Breath of the Wild, he takes on what can only be described as a ghostly form surrounding Hyrule Castle. As the series progressed, we were introduced to another form of this evil, named Ganondorf. This incarnation took the form of a man who was born of a race of women. He was in some sense perceived as a miracle, and took up a position of leadership among his people. He would later shed the form of man and take on the form of Ganon. Finally, in Skyward Sword, we were introduced to a third form of this force, in Demise. Demise was an unspeakably evil creature whose power rivaled that of the goddess Hylia, who had to secret her chosen children, the Hylians, into the sky to protect them, as Demise conquered the surface world. Demise would ultimately prove to be the father of the various evils that would follow him. It could be argued, given his incredible power, that Demise is a sort of evil god, with power seemingly equivalent to Hylia. That's the order in which we were introduced to Hyrule's Dark Trinity, but not the order in which they canonically appeared. Yes, welcome back to Retcon City. In Skyward Sword, canonically the first game in the timeline, though we don't encounter Demise in full until the very end of the game, we do fight off his imprisoned form. You see, Demise was sealed by Hylia during her war with the Demon King. In the Hyrule Historia manga, this also serves as the first meeting of Link and the goddess who would eventually shed her divinity and be born among the humans as Zelda. For most of Skyward Sword then, we see Demise only as the imprisoned, a looming strength, desperate to escape and wreak havoc. It is a form of pure evil that is too strong even for the goddess to hold back forever. At the end of Skyward Sword, as Link defeats Demise, he utters a powerful curse. "My hate never perishes. It is born anew in a cycle with no end. An incarnation of my hatred shall ever follow your kind, dooming them to wander a blood-soaked sea of darkness for all time. The state of demise as the imprisoned, and the first sentence of that curse, are very important to our understanding of Hyrule's Dark Trinity. On the surface, we can see it as equal to Link and Zelda being continually reborn to combat whatever form of evil faces them. But in reality, it's much grander than that, so hold on to it, because we'll be coming back to it later. In the years between the Sealing of Demise at the end of Skyward Sword and the rise of Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, another evil threatened Hyrule. That being said, it is important to note that Vaati was merely a man corrupted by evil. And while one could certainly argue that the source of this corruption was Demise from within his imprisonment, we must understand that Vaati himself was not Demise, nor any of his other forms. He was a pawn of evil, but not the evil itself. We'll see other instances of this throughout the timeline, such as Zant in Twilight Princess and Yuga in A Link Between Worlds. Meanwhile, Demise, who was unable to enter the world as a god, chose to enter it as a man, and saw an opportunity to immediately seize power. The Gerudo are a predominantly female race. According to the Hyrule Historia, the women of the Gerudo will mate with other races because the presence of a male Gerudo is so incredibly rare, happening once every 100 years or so. Because these births are so rare, traditions have arisen around them. If a male child is born, that child is seen as divine, worthy of rule. This was a society in which Demise saw fit to enter the world. If he could not be a god, he could still be worshipped as one. It would be easy to say at this point that Ganondorf is Demise, and in some respects, he is. He is that same evil force. He is Demise become man. But at the same time, Ganondorf demonstrates something Demise never does. Ganondorf cares about the Gerudo. In Wind Waker, Ganondorf speaks not in a way covetous of power, but of the struggles his people endured. He speaks as a king, as a man concerned for his own people, saying, "My country lay within a vast desert. When the sun rose into the sky, a burning wind punished my lands, searing the world. And when the moon climbed into the dark of night, a frigid gale pierced our homes. No matter when it came, the wind carried the same thing, death. But the winds that blew across the green fields of Hyrule brought something other than suffering and ruin. I coveted that wind, I suppose." Ganondorf, though he is begotten of Demise, is not entirely Demise. He exists independently while still being part of that same evil force. But if Ganondorf is Demise become man, then Ganon is simply Demise's evil, an ugly creature that exists as nothing but malice. Ganon does not reason. Ganon does not feel sympathy. Ganon seeks only to consume. Ganon is not an enduring god like Demise. He is not a man like Ganondorf. He is just evil, malice, destruction, disaster, calamity. And it is here that we can see the full cycle that Demise spoke of. He didn't mean that every generation would face a new evil. He was talking about this cycle. Demise as a god who cannot enter the world of man begets Ganondorf and becomes man. Ganondorf, when he loses everything, including his humanity, begets Ganon. And Ganon, when he is overtaken by light, is sealed and begets a god imprisoned. This is why I refer to this cycle as the Dark Trinity. It is quite literally an inversion of the Holy Trinity within Christian theology. The God who becomes man, the man who becomes spirit, the spirit who exists as divine love. Now, as I said earlier, I'm obviously not claiming that this was intentional as some sort of allegory, but using this template does help our perception of what the Dark Trinity is. So, what does this mean? Well, if you watched the trailer for Breath of the Wild 2 and thought, hey, that's Demise, well, you're right to a certain degree. One could look at Demise and say that he is Ganondorf or Ganon. One could look at Ganondorf and say he is Demise or Ganon. Ganon could be Demise or Ganondorf. They are 3 in 1, and they are not strictly linear. Ganondorf can yield the pig beast Ganon, but he can also revert to the imprisoned god Demise, as I would argue we see evidence of when he corrupts Zant in Twilight Princess. Now, one question I've seen come up quite a lot is, if that's Ganondorf, then what was Calamity Ganon? There is an assumption that for Ganon to appear, Ganondorf must become him. I do not think this is the case. As we said earlier, Ganon is often somewhat incorporeal. He appears and disappears at will. Nowhere is this more evident than in Breath of the Wild, in which, for most of the game, Ganon is almost entirely formless. Ganon is simply an evil spirit of hatred and malice. Though Ganondorf's body may be here, decaying, that spirit of evil may still take form, and demise remains sealed, capable of stoking that spirit into manifesting. Now, there is one other theory that this doesn't really address. The idea that this isn't the evil Ganondorf, but rather the ancient hero who stood against Ganon, the one from that tapestry. Maybe he's both. But that's an entirely different video, so you'll have to wait just a little bit longer for that. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, and if you haven't checked out my previous video, Ganondorf Explained, you can probably go take a look at that. There's a link to it in the description. If you want a whole lot more Nintendo news and reviews, you can check out NintendoWorldReport.com. And if you want to join our Discord, there's a link to that in the description too. To find out how to support Nintendo World Report and Nintendo World Report TV, stick around for some info on our Patreon. But in the meantime, I'm John Rairdon, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.